Well, I was born in Egypt in 1948 in the city of Alexandria. But I'll say immediately, although with great sorrow, I'm not an Egyptian. A lot of people assume automatically that if you're born in Egypt, you're Egyptian. The sad thing about Egypt is that you're always a non-Egyptian if you're not by blood, which is a problem, but never mind. I'm born from a family of my father's side were Belgians. They immigrated to Egypt in the 1890s. And my mother's side, Maltese. Alexandria had a very, very large foreign community, about 250,000 in the post-war, in the 1940s, 50s. Big cosmopolitan city. It has always been a cosmopolitan city from the day of its foundation by Alexander the Great. But it regenerated itself in the pre-war days, mainly because of the establishment of the modern Egyptian state after the Napoleonic invasion. And many, many foreigners came to settle there. I'm 3 generations in Egypt. And so I grew up there and went to school there and went to an English school. I left when I was 19 and I went to England. First with a little stop in Switzerland where my brother was living, and I came to complete my studies, which took me till 1973. In those days in my family you either became an architect or an engineer. It was the route that we took. I decided to go into construction engineering. I did it at the South Bank Polytechnic in London. And that's it, you know, I was ready to do a career in the construction industry, which in a curious way I found myself taking overseas jobs. Partly because I wanted to travel and partly because I spoke languages. I spoke Arabic fluently, so it was easy for me. In those days there was a big boom in the building industry in the Middle East, the oil boom, and so it was easy to get good jobs. And I started off with going to Oman. I was there for 5 years. Eventually I found myself in Saudi Arabia on a very senior posting. I was 33 at the time. And quite frankly, minding my own business in Egyptology. I mean, it wasn't my thing at all. I had a vocation like everybody else. I got interested. I read books about the pyramids, but that's about it. Until as things happen. I call it my, although I don't compare myself to Isaac Newton, I still call it the apple that fell on my head. And I'm a great believer that things occur all the time, but we just don't pay attention. Everybody knows about the apple that fell on Newton's head. I don't know if it's a true story or not, but it typifies the reaction of one man who asked the right question: why did it fall? I happened to go to Egypt from Saudi Arabia to visit my mother, who was still living there, and I took a diversion before going to Alexandria. I went to the Cairo Museum. You know, when you live in Egypt, you just don't do these things, you know. Tourists go and see the pyramids, not the Egyptians. So it was an odd thing for me to do, but I don't know, it's something took me there. And I went into a room where they kept the relics of the pyramid builders. It's very little. As you may know, very little has been found of the great pyramid builders. And there was on the wall a picture, a photograph, a very large photograph, taken by the Egyptian Air Force in the 1950s, which showed a direct overhead of the 3 pyramids of Giza. And I recall I had, in those days, I'm talking 1981 here, 82, I can't remember the exact date, where, you know, there was no internet, there was no fax. I mean, you know, the faxes were being introduced then, you know, so a very different world. And it sounds strange for us to say, you know, I was surprised to see an aerial photograph, but you didn't see aerial photographs commonly in those days, you know? Let alone satellite photographs. So to me it was a novelty. I mean, I'd never seen them from the air that way. And I had an old, well, now it's old, I had a nice Olympus camera with a black and white film in it, and I took a picture. And that was it, you know. I returned to Saudi Arabia, developed, and I had forgotten about it until I developed the film. And it just was one of those things. I was surprised that nobody had raised that question, like Newton's question. I saw 3 pyramids, 2 very large ones. They were clearly on a diagonal line. The base of the pyramid is a square. So you had 2 squares running along the diagonal. The 3rd pyramid was much smaller, which in itself was intriguing, and offset to that line, to the east or left side. And that was it. You know, I asked the question, why did they do that? The question that first nagged me was why the 3rd pyramid was smaller. You know, all I had read about from Egyptologists was that these kings who built pyramids were megalomaniacs, and they mobilized their country, and they were, you know, so why would the 3rd builder advertise a smaller pyramid? Because it's called the small pyramid. I mean, you know, it's diminutive. You know, people who go and see the pyramid of Giza, they say, oh, 2 big ones, 1 small. It's not small, it's 65 meters high. But if you put it next to these giants that are 140 meters plus, then it does look small. I'll give you, I'm thinking of an analogy. I mean, I'm a rather tall guy. I'm slightly over 6 feet. But I have my nephew, who, believe it or not, is 7'4". He's a basketball player. And when I go next to him, I look small. I really look small. It's embarrassing. You know, I have pictures with him where he actually lifts me. So why would a pharaoh want to advertise that he was smaller? You know, so the explanation for the Egyptologists, they didn't have the resources. And how did they know they didn't have the resources? He died early. That makes sense. How did he know he was going to die early when he started building his pyramid? And that kind of strange, it didn't make sense. And then I thought, how do you make it fit? I mean, how do you explain that there's a smaller pyramid there next to 2 big ones? And the only explanation that came to mind was that it wasn't an ego problem. You know, it wasn't built by a pharaoh who had resources problems, or he was going to die early or whatever. It was a plan. It didn't belong to an individual pharaoh. It was an overall plan, which seemed to be the case. You had a site with 3 monuments of the same design, 2 almost of equal size and a smaller one. It reeks of a plan, you know. So I thought, okay, that can explain it. It's not a smaller pharaoh or a weaker pharaoh. It's part of a plan, and it had to be small. The question is, why did it have to be small? The answer was obviously in what is the significance of this monument, and that I agree. I agree with the Egyptologists. There's no doubt at all that they are religious monuments, but religious in the context of the builders. And you have to get into the context of the builders. Now, one of the strange things about the Giza pyramids is that they're there, you know, they've been there for thousands of years, but they're silent. There is no inscriptions on them, nor inside nor outside, which in itself is another mystery. The egomaniac pharaohs who built those pyramids didn't bother to tell us that they built them. You know, it's like, I always say, it's like me being a writer. You know, I mean, I'm not an egomaniac, but I'll get pretty upset if my publisher doesn't put my name on the cover. You know, it would upset me. So why would they build the pyramid and the pharaoh would say, well, where is my name? I mean, for posterity, you know, you build this giant monument and nobody knows it's me. You know, so again, this story that I was hearing from the Egyptologists did not fit. Although it's true that the pyramids of Giza, now, to put them in a context, from the 4th dynasty, which is dated roughly to about 2500 BC. The dynasty prior to, the dynasty immediately to them, after them, the 5th dynasty, have built pyramids further south, a few kilometers further south. You can actually see them from Giza. But there's no question that when you see those 5th dynasty pyramids, it comes as a shock, because you compared to the massive and perfect 4th dynasty pyramids, these things are shoddy. They're jerry building. I mean, they're really crumbling. I mean, some of them don't even look like pyramids. They're smaller. They're built with look like in haste, but they contain texts. In contrast to the 4th dynasty pyramids, these things are full of text. I mean, they filled every inch of the inner chambers with texts. Great. Let's see what they say. And these are known as the pyramid texts. Now, I should say this about the pyramid texts: they're authentic. They're actually carved on their original monuments. They're not translations or interpretations. They are the real thing. They're the oldest religious texts in the world, older than the Bible. Strangely, they were greatly ignored. Egyptologists found them boring. They found them too complex and superstitious, and they just didn't bother with them. To me, immediately, I had to get a copy of them. It was not an easy thing in those days. I was still living in Saudi Arabia. And to me, the minute you read those texts, the minute you look into those texts, it's very obvious. They're entirely to do with the desire of the king to go to the sky, to ascend to the sky after he dies. It's full of statements. Now, of course, they're 5,000 years old. They were not meant for you and me to read. They were very occult. They were very private. They probably were not to be seen by other than the king himself and the high priests. And they were sealed inside the pyramid. So, no wonder they're complicated. But there is a logical way to approach them. Now, there's been very good translations of them. And, today we have some excellent translations since the 60s. They were discovered, by the way, in the 1880s. So prior to that, Egyptologists would say the pyramids are mute, they don't speak, Well, here they are, they were eloquently filled with texts. And you can categorize them in, I've done this. I mean, what I did was take what I call direct statements. I mean, the king goes to the sky, that's no ambiguity, The king wants to become a star, and so I put what was direct statements, then what I call second level, third level, where it finally gets very obscure, because they use metaphors that we don't know what they mean. Now, as an example, because, we accept metaphors for granted when we know them. I mean, when we read the New Testament, for example, we say the Lamb of God gave his blood. So if you don't know who the Lamb of God is, you really don't get it. So, you've got to realize that they do use metaphors like this in these ancient texts, and there's a point where you have to abandon it. You just can't get through. But there is no doubt that when you read those texts, the king wants to go to the stars. He wants to become a star. He wants to join his father in the sky. They believed that kings believed that they were the sons of Isis and Osiris, the original founders of their civilization. And that Osiris, after his death, became a constellation, the constellation that we call today Orion. And there he created a kingdom, if you like, for the dead, for the kings. And the kings wanted to join him there. Basically, today we would say it's impossible. We would, unless we build this starship and, whatever. They didn't think like we do, and that's where you have to spend a lot of time with these texts. Now, I'm jumping the gun here because I want to tell you what happened that led me to look into all this deeply. Now, I stumbled, after my return from Egypt, I'm sort of catching back the trip, I stumbled on a passage of these texts not a full translation. There was a friend of mine who had a coffee table book, and the luck of the gods would be that it mentioned the king wanting to go to the constellation of Orion. And it kind of stayed in my head. So I had this picture that I saw, you know, the pyramid, the little one offset, and then this statement. And on one occasion I was in the desert camping with a group of friends, and one of them, a French friend of mine, was a navigator. And that's again before the days of GPS and all this stuff. And he would use the stars. And he explained to me, I mean, very bright sky on that particular night. And he said, you know, if you look at Orion, you see the central stars. Orion is like a rectangle, it's 4 bright stars. And in the middle is the famous belt, 3 stars. And he said, if you draw a line backwards, you'll pick the position of the rising of Sirius. Sirius is the brightest star in the northern hemisphere. Once you've got Sirius and you know its bearing, that's it, you know where to direct yourself. And then, just like that, it's one of those, that's where the apple came. You know, he looked again at the stars, and he was a bit apologetic. He said, no, you know, I said they were in a row, but they're not in a row. There's the 2 bright ones are in a row, and the little one on top is offset. And to me, he was saying the same thing that I was saying about the photograph of the pyramids. And knowing that there was a connection between the king's desire to go to these stars and the pyramids he built, you know, the penny dropped. I mean, you know, the apple dropped on my head. I got very excited, but I mean, it wasn't. At first, I thought, you know, somebody must have noticed this. I mean, it's one of those strange things. You know, I'm sure that I'll waste my time. You know. So I wrote to a few Egyptologists, and it became very obvious that they had never heard of this. And I finally stumbled on the late Professor Edwards, Sir Ivan Edwards, who was very interested. And he invited me to come and see him when I had an opportunity to come to England, which I immediately thought, okay, why not? And the first holiday I had, I knocked on his door in Oxford, very sweet man, and he said, come in, you know, we talked about it. And he told me something that I didn't know. He told me that indeed the Egyptologists had known of a direct connection, not just with the texts, but with the pyramids of Giza, with the Great Pyramid. That inside the king's chamber were shafts, narrow shafts, and one of them had been worked out by Egyptologists and astronomers to have pointed to Orion's belt at the time of the construction of the pyramids. And I thought, well, there you are. I mean, you know, what more do we want? You know, and as I got more into this subject, I discovered something else, which to me was utterly puzzling, because the Egyptologists insisted that the kings who built those pyramids were following the sun cult, that they believed that the pyramids were solar symbols, that they represented the rays of the sun shining down or something like that, or staircases leading into the sun. But as you read the pyramid text, it was very obvious that the king did not want to go to the sun. The sun was the sun god. He wanted to become a star. There's no question about it. On top of that, not the Giza pyramids, but there are pyramids of the same dynasty, one at Abu Ruash, built by the son of King Cheops of the Great Pyramid, and one built by Pharaoh on the other side, north, just a few kilometers, a 4th dynasty pharaoh called Nebka. And here it was. The kings gave names to their pyramids. They identified themselves with the pyramid. They saw themselves as themselves being part of the pyramid. And they named the pyramid. And they named them as a star. The one in Abu Ruash is called Jedefra, is a star. And the one in Zawit al-Aryan is called Nebka, is a star. So what more do they want? The pyramids are identified as stars. The king wants to go to the stars of Orion. There is a shaft pointing to Orion's belt, and the pyramid on the ground looks like Orion's belt. I mean, it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. It must be a duck. And so I thought, I'm going to publish this. And I did. I mean, I eventually, through contacts with Professor Edwards, I published a an article in, actually a series of articles in 1987 to 89. And that's it. I mean, I thought I've done my job, you know, I've downloaded it from my mind and let them do what they want to do with it. But I wasn't satisfied. I mean, nothing really happened. A couple of letters here and there, you know, but that was it. And I thought, this is strange. I mean, this thing is too important. And you know, it sounds strange for me to say this now, but and I'm much older and I'm much more calmer about these things. But at the time, it's hard to explain, but I felt it was a kind of responsibility. I just could not accept that I'd die and I wouldn't have brought this thing out. You know, it just bothered me, and I had to do it. You know, I had to really push it. And so, well, long story, one thing led to another, and eventually I found myself a publisher. And by the luck of things, at the time when I was about to get started with writing this book for a publisher, a German engineer, Rudolf Ganterbrink, explored the shafts of the Great Pyramid. And he found a little door, it's a famous little door at the end of one of these shafts. So there was big news about this, and the whole thing took fire. To me, it was one of those huge 360 degrees situation. I mean, from one day to the next, I became the star pyramid man. You know, my life changed completely. I always remember this. The BBC did a major documentary on it, and I went the next day to London with my wife, and we were visiting some friends, and I stopped in Piccadilly Street, and I wanted to buy some flowers, and the seller said, "Oh, you're the pyramid man." And I thought, my God, you know, I mean, what have I done? You know, and it was overwhelming because clearly I touched a nerve here, especially the way it was presented. I mean, of course, the BBC made it, exposed it. I mean, suddenly, you know, it was broadcasted on a major channel, and everybody saw it. I mean, and who didn't see it were told about it. I mean, every Egyptologist in the country was up in arms, you know. And suddenly I found myself overwhelmed by this. I mean, there was a lot of anger, and Egyptologist so-and-so in this newspaper was saying I was a charlatan, and you know, it went out of control for a while. But I kept my nerves, because it's very unnerving. I mean, you know, you're getting attacked by some very senior people, some heavyweights, you know, professors and deans and all. But then I thought, wait a minute, you know, it makes sense. You know, I don't care what they say. You know, now I use very different approaches. I mean, you know, they were the experts were commenting. You know, they were, and finally I said, well, wait a minute, I'm the expert. I'm the expert on this one. You know, why should I be intimidated by the expert? You know, and frankly, they were coming up with very annoying criticism. First, they did the personality thing. I mean, I wasn't an Egyptologist, and I didn't know what I was talking about, and you know, he's a charlatan, and you know, believe me, I was called a lot of things. And there was some instance where it got very nasty. I mean, in Egypt, I was called a Jewish supporter, a Zionist, and here I was called an anti-Semitic for some reason. I don't know. It all went berserk.
How did it end up having anything to do with the Jews?
Well, here's the weird one: is that the pyramids, there was an old theory that the pyramids were built by the Jews in captivity.
Yeah.
Now, if you supported the theory, you were a Zionist, according to the Egyptians. If you didn't support the theory, to some, you were anti-Semitic. But there you are. I mean, I had people saying you're anti-Semitic, you know, you don't support it. It all came out, because once you're exposed that way, you're out there, you know, and anybody can take a pot shot at you. And in this case, the big guns came out. I mean, it wasn't just the lunatic fringe taking pot shots. I mean, I had, you know, heavy weights. I mean, I had the Ministry of Tourism in Egypt, the director of the Antiquities, you know, but things have, you know, I've learned how to deal with this, you know, and the funny thing about this, I mean, I began to see, I mean, I was getting angry because I began to see that there was a kind of auto da fe here. I mean, not only they wanted my blood, but their arguments were very almost inquisitional. I mean, strange arrogance that came out. I'm not saying in general. I mean, there are some nice Egyptologists and some, but I was astounded. For example, this business about the door. You know, there could be a chamber at the end of this shaft. Maybe there isn't, we don't know. But I had the German director of the German Archaeological Institute who was responsible for the exploration, and I remember sitting next to him with the BBC, and this man quite happily said, there is nothing behind this door. And I remember the BBC guy, you know, taking notes, and so I gave him a nudge. I said, ask him, how does he know? It didn't occur to him, because it's funny how it doesn't occur to people to ask these authorities. They take them for granted. So I said, ask him how he knows there's nothing behind the door. And he said, why do you ask me? I said, well, I mean, how do you know there's nothing behind the door? And all he could say, after getting green and red in the face, was, because I am an expert. I said, you know, I'm Professor so-and-so. So I said, it's not good enough. So I began to see this kind of strange world that I thought academics were very broad-minded and liberal, but there was such a lot of backstabbing, a lot of refusal when things were so obvious. So, you know, I use phrases now like, you know, they can bring me 100 Egyptologists if I'm concerned. You know, I tell them, it doesn't matter how many you bring. You know, truth is not democratic. You don't vote on truth, you know. If it's true, it's true, I'm sorry. You know, you can bring me a zillion professors. And that's, you know, and there's a wonderful phrase by the Robert Schoch, who also did a huge controversy over the age of the Sphinx. And he has a lovely one. I mean, he was once shouted during a geological conference. He was shouted down. And one geologist was very angry, and he stood up and he said, there is not a single Egyptologist who agrees with you. You are not following the professionals. And you know what he said? He had a lovely reply. He said, I do not follow the Egyptologists. I follow the science. That's what I follow. And the science tells me that the Sphinx is older. I'm not going to follow the Egyptologists. And he's right. And there's a kind of arrogance that you find at this high level. It's very disconcerting, but you must hold your ground, and it's the way it goes. You know, I mean, we know history. You know, Galileo and all the Darwin. You know, they got their fair share of this.
Do you think they get very jealous when people like yourself appear in the media?
Yeah, I don't even think it's jealousy. I think it's they really truly begin to believe in their authority, and that's the danger. I mean, you know, it's like the Pope, you know, who believes in his authority. You know, until you challenge his authority. I mean, how do you know? You know, he'll tell you.
Are there any specific groups which have really taken up what you've discovered?
Yeah.
Such as like Freemasons, for instance. Are they interested?
Yeah, I mean, the public was wildly interested in this theory. It still is. I mean, it's a theory that has become, well, almost a household name. I mean, I'm surprised sometimes. I mean, I was renewing my passport at the Belgian consulate a few days ago. And as I walked in, and you know, and they saw my name, said, "Oh, you're a pyramid with Orion." Now, they said the Orion thing. Now, because, yeah, there's a huge interest because it makes sense. I mean, I know this by experience. I mean, I've been in the business for a long time with this theory. You know, give me 12 people, give me a jury, and I am sure that if you present them the case, it's very simple. You know, forget about the Egyptologists, forget about me. You know, let's look at the facts. And if you look at the facts, you will know that the pyramids, especially the Giza pyramids, are astronomically aligned with high precision. They face the cardinal direction. So that alone should tell you that there is something to do with astronomy. The precision of the alignment is such that even the Egyptologists agree you have to use stars. Can't do it with anything else. It has to be a pinpoint of light. Therefore, stars are related to the setting out of these monuments. And then you read that the king wants to go to the stars. And then you find that there is a shaft that pointed to the stars of Orion's belt. And the king wanted to go to specific stars. And then you look at the picture and you say, well, you know, 3 stars, 3 pyramids, 2 large pyramids, 1 offset, small one, 2 stars, 2 bright ones, 1 smaller one offset. You've got a correlation. And then you say, wait a minute, also the way the pyramids are in connection with the Nile, in relation to the Nile, these are the same. They're inclined the same way, they're proportionally the same distance. We've got a correlation here. The question is not whether we got a correlation. The question is whether it is a coincidence. And the evidence that is backed is... Well, if it is, it's one of those incredible things. You know, it just doesn't fit the coincidence. The needle is going into the no coincidence side. It's just one of those. And let me tell you, I mean, I've been with this thing for 25 years. It's not a coincidence. And to ignore it is to me, well, of course, gradually as the dust began to fall and they got, you know, the anger began to dissipate, some Egyptologists began to look into this. And some are open, some at least talk about it. It's been discussed at universities. Where it's taken the right direction is when archaeoastronomers began to look at this. Because frankly, Egyptologists are not the right guys to look at this. You need to know some basic astronomy. You know, you need to understand about precession, for example. You need to understand why the stars look the way they do today and why they change. So that was a problem. Now, my problem was that when you talk to an astronomer, he said, I don't know anything about Egyptology, so I won't talk about it. And when you talk to an Egyptologist, he said, I don't know anything about astronomy, so I won't comment about it. So who's going to comment? You know, the angry guys were commenting. So eventually, there is now a profession. There are chairs at universities that blend the two. We call this archaeoastronomy. People who study archaeology and astronomy at the same time. Because why? It's not just the ancient Egyptians. All the ancient cultures looked at the sky and they have religions related to the sky. Their monuments are aligned to the sky. So you definitely need the input of astronomy. To me it was very obvious that the minute you brought in the missing key, if you like, the minute you brought astronomy into the equation, it worked. If you're looking at the pyramid text without astronomy, to me it was like looking at the balance sheet of an accountant and refusing to say there are numbers. You know, if you don't understand numbers, then how can you read the balance sheet? There is a kind of problem in our culture. We have become uncomfortable with something that we should not be uncomfortable with. We're uncomfortable about the mystery of our existence. You know, scientists feel very uncomfortable with this. They felt uncomfortable discussing my theory, which is a very logical theory. We're not talking about aliens here, we're not talking about paranormal, we're talking about people who wanted to design a cemetery representing that sky zone that they wanted to go. There's nothing crazy about it. In their mind, they were doing something else, of course. In their mind, they were building some sort of spiritual machine, if you like, that was going to launch them there. But there's nothing crazy about it. And yet they refused. They felt very uncomfortable about this. So if they feel uncomfortable about this, forget about talking about, you know, what we obviously all know we have. There is a unseen aspect of our existence. You know, in fact, to be the way at my age now, I realize that 90% of my existence is unseen. It's all going in here somewhere. There is a mystery. There's a great mystery, and we're part of it. And we really don't know. I mean, the other day I was, a couple of months ago, I was invited to give a talk at the Theosophical Society. I'm kind of digressing here to answer your question, because I went to give a talk at the Theosophical Society. I've got a very good friend who you might be interested in, John Gordon. You know John Gordon, the writer, and tell you about him later. Anyway, John Gordon, who is organizes these events, asked me to come and talk. I came from Spain especially to give a talk, and I decided to talk about the cosmology of the ancient Egyptians. I remember I got an immediate reaction from a professional saying you shouldn't call it cosmology, you should call it cosmogony. And I said, why? He said, but because it's a religious, subtle difference. Anyway, so I went to give the talk, and I started talking science, you know, and they felt a bit strange. I was supposed to talk about the ancient Egyptians, and I tried to put everything in a context in something like 5 minutes. I'll try and do it for you here, because we tend to forget this. The thing is that we have two errors here. One is that we are uncomfortable with what we think is the, you know, the oogie-boogie stuff, you know, the voodoo stuff, you know. But we shouldn't. We should on the contrary, we should feel at ease with this. The other is the huge problem we have in our way of thinking is that we externalize the thinking. We think we're going to find the answer somewhere. You know, the funny thing is that we have the answer. You know, we are actually made from the original source. It's true. You know, that fragment that blew up 20 billion years ago is somewhere in you. A piece of it is in you. We're it. You know, and we forgot to internalize our search. I mean, the ancient sages, you were talking about the great masters, they internalized, and the reason they did, luckily they didn't get born in our era, because they would have been influenced and they wouldn't have done it. When you don't have a technology, when you don't have a scientific technology, but you have geniuses, you know, that's the funny thing about when you study history and ancient history and prehistory, you know, it's very annoying when you read that they were supposed to be primitives. There is no reason why there wasn't Einsteins and Newtons and geniuses. They were, but they didn't have the scientific technology. They had the same brain, and they used that brain to internalize. They tried to explain somehow their existence by searching inside. And for all we know, they probably arrived closer to the answers than we will with all our technology. So, to answer your question in a roundabout way, yes, I believe in the mystery, and I believe that for some reason I saw this thing. It's as if the king believed that he was going to return to the point of origin, where it all started, and rejoin his clan of gods. And I thought, wait a minute, what do you mean by this first time? He kept talking about a long time before, when the god Osiris had established. And I thought, wait a minute, if they speak of Osiris as being the stars, what would be the first time of these stars? And of course, it brought me to this idea of precession. There is a cycle of 26,000 years. What would constitute the beginning of such a cycle? And as you observe these stars over that long-term cycle, you can do that with a computer, what seems obviously the beginning is when they're at their low, at their nadir, if you like. And then they rise to the maximum, and then they drop again on this cycle. So I thought, let's look at the beginning. Do they mean something? And I was stunned, because as you brought them down, if you like, if you precess the stars to the beginning, you arrived at a very strange date. You arrived at the date of 10,500 BC, and all the bells began to ring here, because there was the strange prophecies made by the American seer, the Edgar Cayce, which I'm not into that at all, but I thought, how weird. I mean, you know, he guessed it, you know. And then I thought, wait a minute, let's look carefully at the sky. And I remember the software is such that I was looking due south. I was looking at the way the stars moved up and down in the cycle. And the software is such that if you press E, you go east. If you press W, you go western. So for some reason I pressed E. So let's see what happens east. And there it was, floating over the east, precisely due east, was the constellation of Leo. Now I didn't need to be told anything, because I knew that there was a monument that was a lion looking in that direction. And I thought, this is too much. I mean, it can't be. I mean, it's very odd. I mean, now we have two monuments, two sets of monuments, the three pyramids, like Orion in the south, and the Sphinx, like Leo, in the east, locking at the same time. So I phoned Graham Hancock. I said, have a look at this. And I'll go to the grave on this one, because it caused a hell of a lot of commotion. Because the Orion mystery already was causing a fuss, but at least it was within the dating that the Egyptologists gave. But now when we started talking about 10,500 BC, they were not happy at all. But you see, the reason they were not happy is they couldn't simply poo-poo it. The logic was incredibly clear here. The Egyptians invite us to look at Orion. We look at Orion, and then they invite us to look at the beginning of a cycle. We look at the beginning of a cycle, and bang, look what you've got. It's pure logic. There was nice, clear, straightforward logic. Of course, all the arguments, they didn't know Leo at the time and all this stuff, but it was there. And you see, I don't see it like that too much nowadays, but what was going on was suddenly we began to form a camp. We were the alternatives, called an alternative historian. And there were the orthodox. And we realized we were battling. They were, and we began to realize why they were angry, especially with me and Graham Hancock. They were angry because our arguments were solid. Otherwise they wouldn't even bother. And that's what got them angry, is that people would say, well, why do you say they're wrong? I mean, look at their logic, So they got very, very angry, and they just could not knock it. So at one stage we had them on the run, I can tell you. They were, until they sort of regrouped again, and then they became nasty. They would go and fish around experts, and they would have Professor so-and-so saying, I've looked at this and this is rubbish, But it was a strange situation. So
you're kind of pointing out that the Sphinx was either built and...
Well, to answer your question, we wrote another book. And we wrote a book called Keeper of Genesis, which was all about this idea that there was a correlation. If you reconstructed the sky at what you could interpret as the first time that the Egyptians spoke of in the text, this first time of Orion or Osiris, then you had a Cinderella fit. The slipper fitted, this pyramid slipper fitted perfectly. And to me, it's just one of those. I mean, that's it. I mean, so they said, well, how do you explain this? I mean, okay, we see it, but there was no Egyptians in 10,500 years ago. There was, there's no evidence of a culture. There's no evidence. Where are the potsherds? Where are the monuments?